For one afternoon in 1951, the best hitter in the American League, measured by on-base percentage, was a man who stood 3 feet 7 inches tall. His name was Eddie Gaedel. He weighed about 65 pounds. His strike zone measured roughly an inch and a half. And he reached base in the only plate appearance of his entire life, a flawless one-for-one that no Hall of Famer, living or dead, can ever beat. This is the story of the smallest man ever to bat in a major league game, and how one 4-pitch walk forced baseball to rewrite its own rulebook in a single day. It begins with a man who understood something the rest of baseball refused to admit. The game was not only a sport. It was a show. His name was Bill Veeck. In the summer of 1951, he owned the St. Louis Browns, and the Browns were a disaster. They lost almost constantly. They drew almost no one. Some nights the crowd was so thin you could hear a single heckler carry across the entire ballpark. Across town, the Cardinals owned St. Louis. The Browns owned last place. Veeck himself was like no owner the game had seen. He had lost a leg in the Second World War, and he ran his teams from the bleachers, in an open collar, sitting with the fans instead of above them. He had one weapon the standings could never touch: he was a genius of spectacle. He had planted ivy on the outfield walls in Chicago. He had given away live animals and blocks of ice. He believed, down to his bones, that if the baseball was bad, you gave the people a reason to come anyway. You gave them a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. And on August 19, 1951, he had a plan hidden in the clubhouse, one so strange that only a handful of people alive knew it existed. That day, the St. Louis Browns had signed a secret weapon. He was 26 years old. And he was 3 feet 7 inches tall. Eddie Gaedel was a performer from Chicago, a small man who made his living in vaudeville and stunt work. Veeck found him, signed him to a real contract for $100, and swore him to secrecy. He had a tiny uniform sewn together, borrowing a number from the batboard. Gaedel would wear the fraction 1/8 on his back, the smallest number ever seen in the history of the game. The occasion was a doubleheader against the Detroit Tigers, and a celebration of 50 years of the American League, sponsored by a local beer company. Between the two games, the Browns wheeled out an enormous papier-mâché birthday cake to home plate. The crowd of some 18,000 waited for the gag. Then the top of the cake burst open, and out popped Eddie Gaedel, in his little uniform, waving to the stands. The fans laughed. They thought that was the joke. They thought it was over. It had not even started. The second game began. The Browns came to bat in the bottom of the first. And over the public address system came the announcement that made the entire ballpark go still. Now batting for the Browns, number 1/8, Eddie Gaedel. He was hitting for the leadoff man, Frank Saucier, in what would become the most famous substitution in baseball history. Gaedel walked to the plate carrying a toy-sized bat. He dug in. He crouched. And the pitcher for the Detroit Tigers stood on the mound and simply stared. The home plate umpire, Ed Hurley, called time. This had to be a joke. It could not be legal. But the Browns' manager, Zach Taylor, strolled out of the dugout holding a piece of paper, Gaedel's contract, valid, filed, and approved by the league office. Nothing in the rulebook said a man had to be a certain size. Hurley had no choice. He waved them on. Play ball. What the crowd didn't know was what Veek had told Gaedel before he stepped out. Crouched, his strike zone measured about 1.5 inches. His instructions were simple: do not swing. Veek, only half joking, said he had a rifleman in the stands with a scope trained on him, and if that bat ever left his shoulder, he was a dead man. Gaedel did not swing. The pitcher, Bob Kane, started laughing so hard he could barely throw. The catcher, Bob Swift, dropped to both knees to give him a target. Kane lobbed 4 pitches, and every one sailed over the tiny batter's head. Ball 1. Ball 2. Ball 3. Ball 4. Eddie Gaedel had walked. He trotted down to first base, where a pinch runner jogged out to replace him. And as he left the field, the smallest man in baseball history tipped his cap to the crowd and got a standing ovation, perfect at the plate, forever. The crowd was still roaring. But in the American League office, a man had already picked up a pen, and he was preparing to erase Eddie Gaedel from existence. The next morning, the league president, Will Harridge, was furious. This was not baseball, he said. This was a circus, a mockery of a dignified sport. Within a day, he voided Gaedel's contract. He ordered that Gaedel's name be struck from the official records, as though the at-bat had never happened at all. And he changed the rules. From that point on, every single player contract had to be approved by the league office before a man could set foot on the field. The loophole Veek had slipped through, the one that never imagined a person could be too small, was sealed shut forever. Veek fought back the only way he knew how. If Gaedel was never really a player, he asked, then how could the record show that Bob Kane had thrown 4 straight balls to him? Was the pitcher's stat real, or wasn't it? You couldn't have it both ways. Eventually, baseball blinked. Gaedel's plate appearance was quietly restored to the record books. And there it sits to this day. 1 game. 1 walk. An on-base percentage of a perfect 1.000, a number the greatest hitters who ever lived, Ruth and Williams and Cobb, never once reached across an entire career. But the man behind the number did not get a fairy tale. Eddie Gaedel never played again. The single afternoon that made him immortal was also the end of his time in the game. He went back to odd jobs and appearances, trading on his 90 seconds of fame for the rest of his short life. In 1961, at just 36 years old, he was beaten and robbed walking home in Chicago, and died soon after. Only one man connected to baseball came to his funeral, Bob Kane, the pitcher who had thrown him those 4 laughing balls. The two had never spoken again after that day. Kane came anyway. So why does a single walk by a man who never swung still matter, 70 years later? Because Bill Veek was right, and the game spent the next half-century proving it. Veek understood that baseball had to give ordinary people a reason to walk through the gate. The stunt with Eddie Gaedel looked like a joke, but underneath it was an argument. The fans are not an afterthought. They are the whole point. Veek went on to invent the exploding scoreboard, fan appreciation nights, giveaways, and between-innings promotions that every team in every sport now runs without a second thought. The mascots, the contests, the fireworks at any modern ballpark trace straight back to a man who refused to let a bad team be a boring one. And Gaedel became something larger than a gag. He became the permanent argument at the heart of the sport, the tension between the letter of the rules and the spirit of the game. The rulebook never said he couldn't hit. Only after he did it did baseball decide that some things shouldn't be allowed, even when nothing forbids them. Every clever edge exploited since, the hidden ball trick, the extreme infield shift, the doctored pitch, lives in the shadow of the 3'7" man who found the biggest loophole of all, and dared the game to close it. His name still turns up in the strangest places. His uniform, number 1/8, hangs in the Hall of Fame's collection. His single at-bat is taught as the day baseball learned it could be embarrassed, and had to protect itself from its own imagination. He stepped to the plate once. He never swung the bat. And he walked away with a record that is, mathematically, perfect, one that Ruth and Aaron and every legend since would trade nothing for, because they could never own it. Which leaves one question worth sitting with. We remember the giants of the game for everything they piled up over 20 seasons. We remember Eddie Gaedel for 90 seconds and one decision not to swing. So who really understood baseball better, the men who spent a lifetime chasing greatness, or the showmen who proved that a single perfect moment can outlive them all? Follow for more.